Well, our final closing keynote speaker came all the way from England to join the American experiment and to watch us with his outsider's eye that became an insider's eye. And he's written prolifically on themes related to disenfranchisement and people who are living under very difficult and sometimes very oppressed circumstances. His most recent book, besides the one that's just about to come out, is called The American Way of Poverty. He's going to speak about the book. We have copies out there because I figured once you hear what he has to say, you may want a copy. So he's agreed generously to stay afterwards and sign copies if you're interested in having a copy of his book. With no further ado, and there will be time for questions, I welcome Sasha Abramsky.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jim, for organizing this conference. I wasn't able to attend the earlier sessions, but the event looks to be absolutely extraordinary, and the issues covered hit all the core issues of inequity and unfairness in America today. And so I'm really delighted to be here at this conference and to be talking to you about poverty and about equity and about social justice and about the ways that poverty plays out in communities across America in the early 21st century. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different. For much of the last few years, as I've gone around the country and talked about poverty, I've opened with a sort of doom and gloom scenario, because in the years after 2008, you didn't have to look very far to find doom and gloom. There was incredibly bleak data in the housing market, incredibly bleak data in unemployment, incredibly bleak data about state government services imploding. The last few months, it's been a little bit harder to find the bleak data in the headline figures. And so I'm going to open with some good news. If you've been reading the newspapers or watching the news in the last few years, you'll have seen that unemployment, which is one of the key indicators of insecurity, that unemployment has been going down. It peaked nationally at about 10% a few years ago. Today it's back down to 5.1%. Which actually means that if you just look at the headline numbers, unemployment in America is about where it was during the Bill Clinton years, which was sort of widely seen to be an economic miracle. It's a good thing to have low unemployment. It's a good thing to have sizable numbers of jobs created every month. It's a good thing for the individuals who have the jobs, and it's a good thing for the communities, because when there's people employed, money circulates. And it's a good thing for state government and for county government and for city government, because when people are employed, they're paying taxes and government revenues go up. And states like California, that for years and years and years were operating these crazy budget deficits and were having to cut anything and everything they could to the bone. States like California are now seeing budget surpluses, which means they have more money to spend, which means they can build up again public infrastructure left to rot, left to corrode over many, many years. That's good. And you see this in state after state. California's unemployment peaked at over 10%, now way back down again. Oregon's unemployment to the north of us, again, peaked at nearly 10%, now it's down to about 6%. Nevada to the east of us had the worst housing crisis in the country, and as a result, the worst unemployment crisis in the country. Today, Nevada's unemployment is still higher than national average, but it's down to 6.8%. Go to the Midwest, Michigan, epicenter of the car industry. 2007, 8, 9, car industry came close to collapse, and thousands upon thousands of people lost their jobs. Today, Michigan's unemployment is back down to 5.3%. And if you go to rural parts of the country in the Midwest, like Nebraska, for example, unemployment's almost vanishingly small, so under 3%. Now, all of that is good. But Jim didn't bring me down here to talk about good news only. And even if he had, it's not in my nature to only talk about good news, because that usually oversimplifies a complicated story. So let me complicate that story a bit. I'm going to give you a few more numbers, and then I'm going to get on to some of the moral and ethical implications of it all. Yes, headline numbers around unemployment tell you something. They do tell you the economy is improving. But oftentimes, those headline numbers hide as much as they tell. And here's one of the things that's happened in the last few years. When the economy crashed, millions of people lost their jobs. And millions of people spent years looking for work again. Some found work, some didn't. And over time, the people who didn't find work grew more and more and more discouraged, because if you're looking for jobs and you're sending out your resume month after month after month, you're not getting any hits. Nobody's replying to you. Eventually, you decide you're on a false errand, and you stop looking for work. And as soon as you stop looking for work, even if you don't have a job, even if you're desperately poor, even if you're hard scrabble, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, if you stop looking for work, you're not unemployed anymore, according to government statistics. So one of the things we've seen is 3% of the adult labor force in the last 7 years has statistically vanished. They don't have jobs, but they're not unemployed. We have the lowest labor market participation rate in America that we've had in half a century. So yes, some jobs are being created, and that's good. But be very, very careful when you see these headline numbers that tell you that everything's rosy in the employment market, because it isn't. There are millions of men and women around this country, especially in economically depressed regions like the Central Valley, who have vanished from the employment rolls. Here's the second thing that's going on. A number of jobs have been created. It isn't all a statistical illusion. And yet, despite the fact we have 5% unemployment, we still have 1 in 6 Americans, a staggeringly high number, 50 million people, who live below the government-defined poverty line. So how do we square that? How do we have 1 in 6 Americans living in poverty when only 5% of the workforce is unemployed? The only way you can square it is an awful lot of those jobs that are being created pay poverty wages. And if we're going to talk about social justice, we're going to talk about equity and fairness, part of the conversation is about the labor market and how much people are paid for the work they do. Turns out that since 2008, the median wage in this country, the amount half earned below and half earned above, median wage in this country has gone down by 16%. You heard a phrase earlier about month being longer than the paycheck, about people who have wages and they still end up on bread lines at the end of the month. And I know that this exists in communities like Turlock and Stanislav County, because I've been to those bread lines and I've talked to people, and many of them are employed. Many of them are working service sector jobs, but they're paid a scandalously low wage. Turns out this is the case all over the country. In county after county and in state after state, when you look at the jobs that replace the ones that were lost, you find they pay a lower wage. Not just a little bit, but the replacement jobs since 2008, on average, pay 25% less than the jobs that were lost prior to 2008. All over the country, you see that the working poor are struggling harder today than they were 7 years ago, and 7 years ago they were struggling harder than they were early in the 21st century. We are seeing a 2-decade rollback of working Americans' income at this point. And the further down the economic pyramid you go, the more you're seeing a rollback of economic security. And by contrast, the further up the economic pyramid you go, to that 1% at the top, to that 0.1% at the top, to the plutocrats that we claim not to exist, the 0.01%, the few hundred families who control as much wealth as the bottom 150 million Americans. When you get up to that level, things are going very, very well indeed. I'll give you a number to put it in perspective. The 2 richest Americans, not the 200 or 2,000 or 20,000, the 2 richest Americans, between them, control more assets than the annual general fund of California. The two richest Americans have more money between them than California state government has. And California is the 8th largest economy in the world. So we don't have plutocrats in this country. We don't have oligarchs. We just have extremely wealthy people who control more resources than the state governments in the states they live within. So go behind the numbers. Yes, our economy is growing. Yes, we have low unemployment. Yes, the housing market has largely recovered. And yes, the stock market, for those who have stocks, is doing very, very well indeed. But the further down that economic ladder you go, the more you encounter what the Yale political scientist Jacob Hacker terms a great risk shift. And in the great risk shift, the burden of risk on where to get money for healthcare, where to get money for pensions, where to get money to pay for education for your children, where to get money if you're sick and need to take days off work. The further down you go on the economic ladder, the more that risk shift goes on to individuals and their families. Now, what does that mean in a place like Stanislaus County? One thing it means is that 22% of residents in this county, more than 1 in 5 people here, lives below the poverty line. That means if they're an individual, they're on under $11,000 a year. It means if they're a family of 4, they're on under $23,000 a year. But it gets worse if you're young. If you're young in this county, 1 in 3 young people under the age of 18 lives in poverty. Only counties in California worse than that for child poverty are Fresno, Merced, and Tulare counties. All of them Central Valley counties. There's a swath of poverty in this part of California that resembles historically the conditions of the Deep South and the conditions of Appalachia. What that means is, in a county like Stanislaus, in the Central Valley as a whole, the new normal in the 21st century is a profoundly insecure, increasingly unequal place. For the residents of places like Turlock and Modesto, Merced, Fresno, and Stockton, communities on the wrong side of the new economic calculi, lives generally resemble more 19th century living conditions than 20th century conditions. We see the reemergence of slums, we see public health crises, we see extraordinary levels of inequity between those at the top and those at the bottom. Now, for the last many, many years, I've been going around the country talking to people about what this kind of poverty means on a daily basis. So I don't want to just give you numbers today, because numbers risk putting people to sleep. I'm amazed I haven't seen more people asleep in the audience so far. But I promise you now we're going to get a little bit away from the numbers. What does it mean on a daily basis to live in profound poverty? First place I'm going to take you to is North Las Vegas. How many people here have been to Las Vegas? Everybody goes to Las Vegas. You go because it's entertaining and it's fun. How many people here have been to North Las Vegas? Far more than I normally get, but still nowhere near as many as have been to Las Vegas as a whole. If you've been to North Las Vegas, you'll know it's gritty and it's poor. Many parts of it resemble the photographs that Dixie just showed. It's a place of concentrated poverty. I went to a high school there. It's the largest high school in Las Vegas. It's called Rancho. It has about 2,500 students. And I talked to the headmaster, principal, and he said to me, "I want you to meet my homeless counselor." Now, I've been to a lot of schools. I've interviewed a lot of people in a lot of schools, and I've never been told that the person I need to see is the full-time homeless counselor. So I interviewed Angela Urquiaga, and I said, why do you exist? Why do we need a full-time homeless counselor? She said, well, before the economic recession, we had 20 or 30 homeless students. Next year, we had 50 or 60. Then we had over 100. When I interviewed her in 2011, the school had calculated they had over 200 homeless students. 8% of the students in that school were homeless. And some of them were living on couches or in spare bedrooms at friends' houses. Some of them were living in church basements with their families. Some of them were living in cars with their parents, and some of them were on the streets. Las Vegas Strip was 3 miles away, and the principal of the school said to me, "How do these children have a chance? We're trying to teach them about civics. In Washington, D.C., and the way government's structured, these kids haven't even been down the road to the Las Vegas Strip. Their lives are absolutely circumscribed by the absolute nature of the poverty that they live within." Come back here to the Central Valley. There's a man called Matthew Joseph who I met in Stockton, just north of here. He was middle-aged, was a deacon at his church. He worked in the steel industry until the recession hit, when he and dozens of his colleagues were called into the office and one after another told they no longer had jobs. Matthew Joseph had a house that a few months earlier was worth upwards of $400,000 until the housing crisis imploded Stockton's housing market, and overnight his property value declined by 2/3. So he had a mortgage he couldn't remortgage or refinance. He had no job. He had a family to support. He said, "I went home and I curled up in a fetal position on my bed, and I began to cry because I didn't know how I was going to keep a roof over my family's head." I went to rural New Mexico, to a tiny little town in southern New Mexico called Anthony, and I met a couple there who had been living in a mobile home on a little bit of land. And he lost his job, and they couldn't make the payments on their mobile home. So they moved into a cinder block storage unit next to the mobile home. When I met them, they were living in that storage unit, and it was unventilated. It had no windows. It had no heating. It had no electricity, and it had no running water. And in the center of the room was a wicker chair with a hole cut out in the middle and a chamber pot underneath. And at the end of the interview, I said to the woman, "What is your dream?" And she laughed at me nervously, and she looked at the chair. She said, "I dream one day that I will be able to live in a house with a flush toilet." Went to Appalachian, Pennsylvania, 2,000 miles east. I met a woman called Luann Prokop, middle-aged, university-educated, had a professional career as an accountant until she lost her job and was downsized. Sent out her resumes, made phone calls and couldn't get other jobs, ran through her savings, ran through her retirement, fell behind on her mortgage, stopped buying food, started losing weight, literally belt-tightening. And when I met her, she'd finally found work. She was working at a community center for 1/3 the wage that she'd used to work for. And the only good thing was that that community center had a food pantry, and that food pantry gave out free food. And because she earned so little, she qualified for charity food at the end of each month. Now, all of these people, the men, the women, the children that I'm telling you about, the common denominator is they're all on the wrong side of the 21st century economic calculi. They're all on the wrong side of that great risk shift that produces extraordinary wealth at the top and extraordinary poverty and insecurity at the bottom. Now, anecdotes tell you part of the story. Data tells you the other part, so bear with me while I go back to the data again. In city after city, especially in the Deep South, at least 1 in 4 children is routinely living in poverty. In New Orleans, if you're African American, 2 out of 3 African American children live in poverty. In Detroit, African American kids again, 2 out of 3 African American kids in Detroit live in poverty. Nearly 1 in 6 Americans is what the government terms food insecure, which means on a daily basis they might not be going hungry, but they're not sure where they're going to get their next meal. Some rely on food stamps, some rely on food pantries, some rely on churches, some just rely on buying cheap junk food that will temporarily fill them up, but at a tremendous long-term health cost. What else does poverty mean? Well, despite the Affordable Care Act's success, and it has been a success, it's brought 15 million Americans into the insurance system. 15 million people who previously had no ready access to health care. Despite that, 30 million Americans remain uninsured. In the richest country in the world, 1 in 10 people has no ready, safe access to healthcare. They rely on emergency systems if they get sick. They rely on charity medicines if they get sick. If they don't get those charity medicines, they either don't get treated or they have to skip rent or skip meals to cover their medical bills. What else does poverty mean in 21st century America? Well, despite the fact there have been some moves in the last few months and years to modify our rush to mass incarceration, we still have 2 million people living behind bars on any given day in jails, in prisons, in federal facilities around the country. 2 million Americans. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher than communist China, higher than Russia, higher even than apartheid-era South Africa a generation ago. There is no country on earth with an incarceration rate like ours. What does that have to do with poverty? The overwhelming majority of prisoners are poor, disproportionately African American or Latino, disproportionately people who grew up in tough environments, didn't have access to educational opportunities, and didn't have access to job training and to jobs. What else does poverty mean? It means people who can't access standard, regular credit mechanisms because they're poor, getting trapped in payday loan scandals. And I say scandal because payday loans charge up to 500% a year interest. The poorest Americans end up paying by far the highest interest when they need to borrow. What else does insecurity mean? It means that one student after another is going into unsustainable debt because governments have rolled back their commitment to higher education, and everybody knows that higher education is absolutely vital if you want to have a chance out of poverty. So we ratchet up huge levels of student debt. $1 trillion of student debt now in this country. What else does poverty mean in 21st century America? One of the things it means is that social mobility has collapsed. What do I mean by that? Well, we used to have this image. I've never understood the image because physiologically it makes no sense. But we used to have the image that if you leant down and pulled yourselves up by your bootstraps, you would levitate up the economic ladder. And you can't really do that. If you try and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you just fall over. But the image maybe made some kind of sense, which was that in the past, the trade-off for lower taxes than they had in, let's say, Denmark or Sweden, the trade-off was dynamism, that it created economic dynamism, and with a bit of oomph and a bit of spirit, anybody had a fair shot at making their way up the ladder. Well, that was always an oversimplified story. Now, it's not just an oversimplified story, it actually is an untrue story. Because if you look at the social mobility data, for the last generation, America's been less socially mobile than all those countries that tax more, produce a safety net for their citizens, pay for their education, pay for their childcare, pay for their sick leave, pay for their pensions. All of those countries have higher social mobility. What does that mean in practice? Practice, it's very simple. If you're born in poverty in 21st century America, you're far more likely to stay in poverty your whole life, to die in poverty, and to pass that poverty down to your children and grandchildren than their equivalents in Europe or Japan, in Canada, Korea, Australia, or any of the other wealthy countries that we like to compare ourselves to. Now, some people say, well, this is all temporary. We had an economic wobble in 2007, 2008, caused a lot of chaos, and we're trying to sort of dig our way out. And when we dig our way out, everything will be good again. The problem with that is a lot of these trends began way before 2008. 2008 made visible things that were going on and had been going on at least since the 1980s. Now, there had been a moment when we made a good faith effort as a country to tackle poverty. 1962, social justice activist called Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America. And he was writing at a time when poverty wasn't supposed to exist. There was this narrative of endless affluence, of an emerging dominant middle class. Poverty was something that sort of had existed before World War II, but in the 1950s and early 60s, it was impolite to talk about it. Politicians didn't talk about it, economists didn't talk about it, educators didn't talk about it. Michael Harrington talked about it because he worked with and lived with the poor, and he knew poverty existed. It existed in Appalachia, it existed in slums in New York and Chicago, it existed in rural America. He knew it existed. So he decided to write a book to tell the stories of the poor and to embarrass liberal America into taking action. He writes this book and he challenges America to take action. And the American system, the political system, responded. 2 years later, Lyndon Johnson, the new President Johnson, who'd come into power after Kennedy's assassination, announces a war on poverty, commits the moral and the economic and the political resources of the country to fight poverty, and to use our most creative energies, our most creative intellectual energies, to think of programs that are going to work, to bring people out of poverty, to create more economic security and stability. For 10 years, from 1964 to 1974, we put effort into anti-poverty programs, and we put money into anti-poverty programs. Poverty rate halved. It went from 22% to 11%. That was a huge achievement. Trouble is, Johnson framed it as an all-or-nothing thing. He didn't say we're going to make a really good faith effort to end poverty. What he said is, we're going to end poverty. As simple as that. We're going to eradicate it. He used the same language that Kennedy used when he said, within 10 years, we're going to get a man on the moon. Well, that made sense for the moonshot, because you either do or you don't. It's no good saying, well, we got a man 2/3 of the way to the moon and then we had to turn around. It doesn't work. So for Kennedy to make that commitment to get a man on the moon made sense. For Johnson to say, we're going to put in all this effort and we're going to end poverty, didn't really make sense. It set up the conditions for reaction. Because by the mid-70s, even though the poverty rate's halved, you still see drug addicts, you still see homeless, you still see the mentally ill, you still see the unemployed, you still see visual indicators of poverty. And Americans who don't necessarily know the statistics, but they do see what they see on the streets, in the 70s began getting very angry at the war on poverty. They began thinking it was throwing good money after bad, and a political reaction sets in. We started blaming the poor for their poverty instead of looking at societal responses that could fix those conditions. We started rolling back anti-poverty efforts. We started taking our eye off the ball, and then not just taking our eye off the ball, but actually pushing that ball backwards. By the 80s, you started seeing these explosions in homeless numbers. You started seeing these homeless encampments that we now take for granted in all our big cities. You started seeing thousands of mentally ill left untreated on the streets. You started seeing entire communities left to rot as old industries disappeared and new ones didn't come in. And no longer did we regard it as a moral imperative to address those challenges. Instead, we said, not our problem. We're doing okay, you're not doing okay, you must be doing something wrong. Increasingly, we used a language of punishment to talk about the poor. We assumed they were cheaters, scam artists, con artists. We assumed they were out to milk the system and exploit the system. We assumed that if people were homeless, they had done something wrong. We assumed that if someone was unemployed, it was because they had made the wrong choices. We made an assumption that poverty equated to moral failing. And the results were evident all around the country. Again, preceding 2007, 2008, they were evident in the boom years. You could go to any community, and if you put in a bit of effort, you would find a food line. And in many of those communities, you would find a food line around the block. Food lines that resembled the bread lines of the Great Depression 60 and 70 years earlier. Go to any community and you would see homeless living under freeway on-ramps and bridges, in parks and along riverfronts. Go to any community and you would see children who were going to school unfed after a weekend at home, and the only food they were getting was lunches and breakfasts on the free school breakfast lunch programs. And that was in the boom years. Post-08, all of these trends get magnified. Post-08, the poverty starts percolating ever broader. starts running into areas that previously had thought themselves immune from poverty. And we saw it with middle-class areas going into foreclosure crisis. And we saw it with people who thought they had stable employment ending up unemployed. And we saw it with people who never thought they were stable, but thought they maybe had just a little bit put aside, ending up running ever faster just to stay in place, working for companies like Walmart that paid below minimum wage in some cases, or just above minimum wage in other cases, and ended up putting off their employees onto the public sector. You ended up with a crazy situation where some of the largest companies in the country were holding training sessions telling their employees how to apply for food stamps and how to apply for state medical assistance for their uninsured children. So that every taxpayer in this country, everybody in this room who pays taxes, ended up subsidizing the low-wage practices of Walmart and McDonald's, Burger King, and all these other companies that make their profits based on the paying of near minimum wage. Which is why I met a woman called Mary Vasquez in Dallas, Texas. She was old enough to retire. She had no money to retire. She had cancer, she had diabetes, she had heart problems, and she was eating TV dinners because she couldn't earn enough and save enough at Walmart to eat anything other than TV dinners. That's why I met a woman called Vicenta Delgado on a food line in North Philadelphia. She had a brain tumor and was dying, but every Saturday she had to get to that food bank at 7 in the morning, even though they didn't open till 11, because if she didn't get there at 7, by the time she got to the front of the line, there was no fresh meat left, and the only fresh meat this dying woman could get was free meat given out by the food pantry. When I started writing my book, I went to Cambridge, Harvard, on the East Coast, to talk to a man called Marshall Gantz. And I'd known Gantz for a few years. He cut his teeth here in California, working for Cesar Chavez. Been a community organizer for years and years. Now he was in his 60s, and he was working for the Kennedy School of Government, teaching leadership to students at Harvard. I went to him and I said, Marshall, I'm writing a book about poverty. Help me understand it. And he stopped me and he said, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am. I promise you. I got a contract. I'm writing a book on poverty. He said, no, you're writing a book on inequality. Let me tell you the story of the miner's canary. So he told me the story of the miner's canary. Go back about 100, 150 years. Mines didn't have gas monitoring equipment like we do today. But that didn't mean there was no gas in the mines. And the miners knew that every so often there'd be an explosion and people would get hurt or die. And they also had learnt techniques over the centuries to mitigate some of that risk. And one of the things they'd learned was that canary birds are a very good thing to take down into mines with you for 2 reasons. Canary birds always talk. They never shut up. They're always chit-chattering away. The second thing is they're uniquely susceptible to very, very small traces of toxic gases. So if you've got that canary bird down in the mine with you, suddenly you hear silence. You look over and you've got a dead parrot on your hands, to paraphrase Monty Python. You've got a problem, because what it means is your environment's been compromised. And even though you can't feel it yet, you're starting to breathe toxic fumes. And Gantz said to me, this is what poverty is. It's an advanced indicator that our political and economic environment has been compromised. We might not know it yet, but things are coming down the line that are going to impact us profoundly, because we've reached levels of social inequality, levels of social inequity that we haven't seen in over 100 years. We're now at a point where we have a new gilded age for the rich and a new age of chronic insecurity and anxiety for the poor. And we've got a growing number of rich at the very, very top and a hugely growing number of poor at the very, very bottom. And the middle is being squeezed out of the political process and the economic process. And when that happens, Gantz said, you go back through history, all the way back to Pericles in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago, and the political philosophers warn you that that is when you have huge stresses placed on democratic political processes. Because how does a system of democracy and participation and community survive when some people have everything and most people have nothing? Now, Gantz's intervention helped me with something, because it's tempting to think of poverty as a tragedy, a little bit like an earthquake or a tsunami. It's an act of God. It's something we can't help. it happens, it hurts a lot of people, we move on. Or we shrug our hands, or maybe we donate to charity and we feel a little bit better, but we don't fundamentally reanalyze our place in the cosmos because of a tragedy. But a scandal's a little bit different. If something is a product of human choice or failure to choose, product of political priorities, a product of who's valued and who's not valued, a whole different story emerges. If a country as wealthy as America, as rich in resources as America, a country that produces as much food as does America, has the kinds of poverty and the kinds of inequity that I've been describing, that isn't a tragedy. It's a product of choice. It's a product of how we tax some people and how we don't tax others. It's a product of what we invest in and what we don't invest in. It's a product of what we value and what we don't value. And as soon as you realize that it isn't some abstract act of nature or act of God tragedy, suddenly things become possible. You can't legislate against a tragedy. You can't say, well, I don't want there to be any more earthquakes, therefore I'm going to pass Senate Bill X and there will be no more earthquakes. It doesn't make sense. But you can say, I'm going to start passing laws that are going to have an impact on human-created conditions of poverty amidst affluence. People are poor in America not because we've had crop failures. They're poor in America because we've made a series of choices about how we distribute resources. People are poor in America, don't have access to health care, not because we don't have enough doctors. We have more doctors than any other country on earth. 10% of the country doesn't have access to regular medical care because we've made a series of choices about how we provide medical care or don't provide medical care. There's no reason on earth that the richest country in the world should have tens of millions of people earning sub-poverty wages. And yet they are in this country, not because of any innate act of God, but because we have failed miserably to raise our minimum wage to a living wage level at a national level. Which is why we're now seeing a living wage movement in all of the progressive states and all of the progressive cities in America, because finally voters in those cities, in places like New York and Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles, in states like California and Connecticut, are getting fed up with the fact that political parties in DC are completely unable to get a consensus around a living wage. And so we're seeing people on the ground at a grassroots level taking action on their own and voting local wage ordinances into place. Now, it's not just about wages. If we had a more progressive tax system, we could raise huge amounts of money very, very easily to fund things like public works programs so that during great economic crises, tens of millions of people don't lose their jobs. Tiny tax increase, workplace tax increase, like Social Security, 0.25% payroll tax could basically make most people's higher education free. We could universalize the cost of higher education. Things like a financial transaction tax. Tiny tax, again, of somewhere in the range of 0.25% on all of those millions of transactions that go on every day in the financial world. Economists have estimated that would raise tens to hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's a lot of money, and you can do a lot with that money, and you can put in place programs to job train people, to reinvest in communities that are underinvested in, to provide decent public security in towns that had to lay off huge numbers of trained police officers during the financial crisis, to create schools that have adequate numbers of teachers and teachers of an adequate quality to teach children properly. Other countries have worked out ways to do it. The fact that America isn't in the year 2015 says much more about our priorities than it does about the inherent impossibility of creating meaningful anti-poverty programs. Now, where I'm going to end this is with a moral plea. I've told you some stories about men and women and children in poverty, and I'm sure that you know many, many other stories, friends, neighbors, relatives, colleagues, who have hit hard times and had economic insecurity redefine their sense of self. Millions of Americans are in that condition, which makes it a moral imperative to act. We can't afford to say, we didn't know that there were hungry children, because the evidence is out there. We can't afford to say, we didn't know there were people going bankrupt in the wake of illness, because the stories are out there. We can't afford to say, we didn't know there were millions of Americans working 40 hours a week and still ending up with empty fridges and empty pantries, unable to feed their families, because the evidence is out there. The evidence is clear that poverty is a moral crisis. And I believe that we can fix this. We'll never entirely eliminate poverty. We can do a whole bunch better than we are doing now. And we have to do a whole bunch better, because if we don't, Marshall Gantz's warning will come true. The poverty we're now seeing is so profound, the economic insecurity is so pervasive, that unless we decide to act on this, over the coming decades, it will become one of the central destructive stories in modern-day America. On that, I'm going to end it. Ask me as many questions as you like. Thank you for inviting me.
Two-part question. One is where the two richest persons you mentioned?
I believe it's Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. I'm not sure about that, but I'm pretty certain. And the third one is the Amazon founder, whose name is Jeff Bezos. Between the three of them, they control over $160 billion.
The second part is the demographics showing that maybe in the next 10 years, the Hispanic Latinos want to be the highest minorities in California. Do you do any study regarding the poverty of Hispanics in the state of California, or you did the whole United States?
No, I did a lot of research on demographics and poverty, and what you see is that Latino and African American poverty is higher proportionately than other groups. But it's a mistake, it's a really serious mistake, which a lot of people make, to say, oh, it's only, quote unquote, an African American and Latino issue. And that's a mistake for two reasons. First of all, even if it was only an African American or Latino issue, that in no way, shape, or form should diminish the moral imperative of action. But the second thing is, when you actually look at the numbers, the largest pool of poverty in this country, by sheer virtue of the demographics, is white poverty, because there's so many white people in this country. And when people ignore white poverty and Asian poverty, we're ignoring a huge part of the problem. So when you go to, let's say, the Ozarks, or when you go to Appalachia, you see white poverty that is extraordinary, really, really severe poverty. And I think we tend to sort of minimize that in our public imagination. We tend to reduce poverty in our imagination to the inner city, to the barrio, and so on. And it oversimplifies a very, very complicated problem. Now, that said, the poverty in the Central Valley in California in particular is very tied in with agricultural workers. And a lot of that is tied in with immigration and immigration status. And so you end up with these sort of hugely complicated problems where poverty and race and ethnicity do tend to be overlapped in some communities in California. And then you end up with secondary issues. For example, with the undocumented immigrants, one of the huge triggers of poverty, and I know you talked about it at this conference earlier, is the issue of healthcare access for the undocumented. So you have seasonal workers who lack legal status, who don't have enough money to buy private health insurance, and who don't qualify for any state or federal health systems. And so these kind of discussions have to be had if you're going to tackle poverty in a state like California. Welcome. Yeah, in the back.
Of course, I was just listening to the Democratic debate forum, and Bernie Sanders, of course, I think is very articulate about bringing out the issues that you're talking about as a candidate. So thinking about the U.S. and where it stands, bring
You
people
know,
out the streets and make some changes, or do you think that things dialectically are going to fall apart?
you know, I'm not a statistician on elections. If you want the good answer on that, you need Nate Silvers from the New York Times up here. But I will say that whether or not Bernie Sanders has a chance of winning, his presence and the things he's articulating in the debates is shifting the political conversation in a very important way. And if you think about the fact, you look at where his money is coming from. He's getting small donors, and he's getting lots and lots of small donors, and he's getting grassroots groups, and he's getting groups that care about economic equity. And then you sort of look where Hillary Clinton's money is coming from, and it's mostly corporate and it's mostly large donors. Not exclusively, but all her top donors are huge and they're corporate. And I do think that reflects differences in priorities. And I'm not here to sort of say, Bernie Sanders good, Hillary Clinton bad, or for that matter, Democrats good, Republicans bad. That's not what I'm I'd rather sort of just say that the issues are important, and that it's important that there are political figures out there who prioritize them. And I happen to believe Bernie Sanders is doing a good job of prioritizing those issues, regardless of whether or not he's electable. So more power to him for doing that. Anyone else? Yes.
We're talking to half the sky. Women earn 70 cents on the dollar for each dollar earned by a man. And most of the jobs that pay minimum wage are women, are women workers. And 20% of women are staying home because of their cost of childcare. Yeah. What would you say to women here as a group?
I would say to everybody, women and men, that this is scandalous, that we're the only wealthy industrial democracy, as far as I know, that doesn't provide the kind of access to childcare that is needed for people to enter the workforce and to succeed, and for their children to be in a safe environment. We don't provide paid family leave, we provide unpaid leave. We don't provide guaranteed health care. We don't provide all these things that make family possible and that make it possible for women to thrive in the workplace while their children thrive. So that's one thing. The other thing about the wage differentials, you're absolutely right that disproportionately the very low-wage employee jobs are in service sector work, which historically, for various reasons, has had a higher percentage of female workers. So we're talking about domestic workers, we're talking about fast food workers, home health aides, and so on and so forth. But there's nothing, here's how I'd respond to it. There's nothing inherent in those jobs that says they have to be low paid. There's an analysis out there that sort of says, well, the old blue-collar jobs that paid great wages have all disappeared, so what do we expect? We've got these service sector jobs and people take them, and we've got to accept they're going to pay lower wages. That's wrong on so many reasons, and here's how I'll explain it. If you go back 100 years, those blue-collar jobs we assume pay well, mining, steelwork, railway jobs, car jobs, all those big, brawny, sweaty jobs, we assume they pay well. You go back 100 years, they paid abysmally, workplace conditions were incredibly dangerous, there were no benefits, there certainly were no paid holidays, there were 6-day weeks, and there were usually 12-hour days. And something happened in between. So what happened in the last 100 years to make those jobs pay well, provide benefits, create middle-class standard living? So, unions, exactly. In the intervening period, those were the jobs that were unionized, not because employers suddenly felt like, hey, we're going to give a contract to the union, but because unions struggled for years and years, went on strike, suffered, and eventually won union recognition. And we've dismantled the union culture in this country over nearly a half-century, which is why today the jobs we're seeing are non-unionized service sector jobs. You unionize domestic workers, you unionize fast food workers, you unionize home health aides, and suddenly those jobs pay just as well as the steel workers and the car workers and the miners. So that's what I would say to men and women. Unionize. It's a good thing, not a bad thing.
It's not right that, if I'm correct, Mr. Reagan was the main guy to take away the union.
Yeah.
Reagan.
you can trace a lot of the discussion that we've been having around poverty to what happened in the Reagan period. The rollback in the anti-poverty programs mainly is the Reagan period. The complete failure to provide for the homeless and the complete collapse of affordable housing infrastructure mainly goes back to the Reagan period. A lot. No. Yeah, you know, and NAFTA comes in after Reagan, but you know the groundwork is certainly laid. The economic language is laid in the late 70s, early 80s. You know, but your mentioning of NAFTA is important because, again, when I was saying earlier, I don't want to say Democrats good, Republicans bad, et cetera, both parties bought into an economic narrative from the early 80s onwards around lower taxes, around globalized trade structures. Both parties bought into an economic narrative that ended up creating tremendous wealth at the top on the theory that that wealth would trickle down, and it didn't. It didn't trickle down at all. What happened was people at the bottom got a few crumbs, but basically got poorer. And people at the top disproportionately grabbed the incredible growth in productivity and growth in wealth that accumulated. So, you know, NAFTA is a case study. Reagan might have set the groundwork for all of this, but certainly under Bill Clinton, it continued apace. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. One of the things I really like about the work is how you frame the situation that we're in as the outcome of a series of choices. Didn't just happen. We let it happen by making certain decisions. That suggests to me that we have to make other choices,
Exactly.
and we should be deliberate about it. Maybe in your statement of unions, but what would you prioritize as the first different choice we need to make to work things?
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right that choices made can be unmade and new choices can be made. That's the nature of good politics. It's the nature of grassroots politics. What I would say we need to do, we need a new discussion about unions and other forms of grassroots organizing, because despite the language that we hear from conservative politicians routinely that unions are corrupt, et cetera, historically they've always been a necessary balance to the accumulation of wealth right at the top. We need to have a conversation about taxes. Nobody's talking about the taxes that were introduced in this country under Republican President Eisenhower, but we do need a sensible tax conversation. And the reason I say Eisenhower is if you go back 60 years, marginal tax rate, the top tax rate in this country was 91%. So if you were very, very rich in the country in the 50s, that last part of your income was taxed at 91%, and that was a President Eisenhower tax rate. Even under Nixon, the top tax rates were way over 50%. So again, when you're talking about it all started with Reagan, the rollback of taxes at the top and that language that taxes are bad and they're sort of somehow some kind of highway robbery is completely reshaped under Reagan. And for the last 35 years, we've had a discourse that doesn't allow for progressive taxation as a social good. You can't run a government if you're not taxing the wealthiest individuals and corporations at an appropriate level. You just can't. You can't get enough money, especially as income is ever more concentrated at the top. If you're taxing capital gains at 14%, if almost every estate in the country is immune from the estate tax because we don't tax the first $5 million of property transfer when someone dies, if you have tax codes like that, it becomes almost impossible to create the infrastructure to tackle poverty, and not just poverty, but social equity in general. So conversation on taxes, conversation on unions, and a conversation on universal health care, because even with the Affordable Care Act, 10% of Americans have no health care. And you do those three things, and you will start getting a much more sensible discussion about social priorities. And living wage would be the fourth thing. So any more hands?
Do you say that the undocumented person that comes to work here in the United States is helping the economy or it's not?
Do I think they're helping the economy? Yeah, I do. And I think that the debate about immigration in this country is completely insane. The fact that you have wealthy, you know, I've spent a lot of time interviewing people who are undocumented and going into undocumented communities, and I spent a lot of time on the border. interviewing people and looking at what happens on the border. And the fact that people thousands of miles from that border honestly think it's a good policy to build a 2,000-mile wall to keep out economic migrants who come here to work in vital industries shows a complete misunderstanding of how the country's economy functions. And it doesn't make any sense at all for Donald Trump, and this is where I will get partisan. When Donald Trump goes up on stage and starts, as a billionaire, starts beating up on people who make $6,000 and $7,000 a year picking lettuce and onions, is one of the most offensive things I've ever heard. So, yes, I think that overwhelmingly people who come here without documentation come to work, and they come because they need income for their family, and they come because the places they're coming from have been beggared by treaties like NAFTA. Of course they're going to come. I would too if I were destitute and had no options where I were living. It's just human nature.
If you still not answer my question is, if that document people is going to improve the economy of the United States?
If you give them documentation?
No. If the people that are coming from Mexico or whatever, South America, to work here, are improving the economy in the United States?
Well, I think they are, but I also think that I think they are improving the economy, but not always for the most savory of reasons. And here's where it gets complicated. We do say, well, they work very hard and they work for low wages. Well, the reason they're working for low wages is not because people south of the border inherently like working for low wages. They're working for low wages because they're living in the shadows and they're very economically vulnerable. So if the argument is they help the economy because they work at below minimum wage and therefore make agricultural prices cheap and so on, I'm not convinced by that argument, because I think we should have living wage for everybody regardless of legal status. And so, any other questions? Yes.
How much do you feel the bootstrap, pull yourself up by the bootstrap mentality is still why people are letting so many people fall behind, because they just feel like those people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps too, even though it's very
I think it's a huge part of the story that for many, many, many reasons it's built into our national mythology that we are a can-do country, and we are a can-do country, and people do come from all over the world, and many, many millions do make it, and that's something wonderful. And I, in no way, shape, or form, would negate the importance of that. And I'm doing a story at the moment on refugees, and I've been interviewing people from Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Bhutan and from many, many different countries who have come as refugees and are doing wonderful things here and really, really, striving to make it, and believe they have tremendous opportunities here that they would never have had in their old countries. And there is something about that that's true. You can't, the whole world does come to a country like America, and the whole world does come to cities like New York and to Los Angeles, and you see it, and it's wonderful. And certainly, to me, there's nothing more wonderful than a thriving, cosmopolitan, multilingual, multi-ethnic city. I absolutely love New York and London and Paris and all the other great cities where you see the whole world. And I think that, it's too easy to say none of that's a reality. But I think the reality is always at risk of sort of morphing into a mythology. And, it's great when it's real, and it's awful when it becomes a mythology that stands in the way of necessary social policy. And so if it becomes this sort of substitute for reality, and when you listen to some of these policy debates, and one wealthy politician after another espouses the virtues of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. And I don't know if anyone in the audience has seen Donald Trump's interview where he talks about how he's a self-made man and he had it hard because his father only loaned him $1 million. I'm sorry, that's not a self-made man. That's definitional. That's something else. But if you have one wealthy public figure after another saying, well, I did it myself, therefore why can't they? It becomes a crutch. And then it allows you to sort of turn a blind eye, and you sort of walk past the homeless because they failed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and you walk past those hungry children because their parents failed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and it becomes something ugly. And I think we can do not just a little bit, but a lot better than that in our discourse. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back.
Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel in all the research?
Yeah, I do. Not
What kind of light?
the light I see is a local light, not a federal light. I don't see a federal light in DC at the moment because it seems to me that there's so much political acrimony and stalemate and irrationality in the federal political process and the federal debates. But if you go down a level to the states, we're seeing some really creative stuff. And I'll come back to the living wage movement. 5 years ago, nobody would have said that fast food workers would have been able to capture the moral imagination and push for $15 an hour. And they have. And you know, you can talk to the mayor of Seattle and the mayor of New York and the mayor of San Francisco and the mayor of LA, and they'll all talk about the moral imperative of a living wage. You can, look at the environmental policy, same thing. Nothing really, despite the president's decision today on Keystone, federally we're doing abysmally on global climate control and greenhouse gas emissions controls. We're just not stepping up enough. California's doing wonderfully. California's got the most stringent greenhouse gas mandates in the world at this point. So I do think there's a light, but I think it's going to come from state and local governments being pushed by state and local grassroots movements rather than big stuff happening in DC in the next few years. Anyone else, or should we end on the light note? Yep, all right then. Thank you very much.